The stories in the initial chapters of Matthew and Luke are regarded instead as evidence that by the end of the first century some Christians came to account for Jesus' origin by telling these stories. In other words, historians commonly treat these chapters as factual evidence for early Christian beliefs about Jesus, but not as historically reliable information about Jesus himself, though the birth stories may contain reliable information, such as the names of his parents. On this basis, solid historical evidence about Jesus begins with the reports of his baptism by John the Baptist. But these reports, too, include the miraculous, the coming of the Spirit as a visible event, and the voice of God saying, "You are my Son, the beloved," or my beloved Son. "With you I am well pleased." Since Jesus' acceptance of John's baptism is rarely doubted, historians generally grant that somehow Jesus' consciousness of a special vocation began in relation to his baptism, and they regard the dove and the words of the voice to be legendary details that expressed early Christian conviction about his relation to God. So, too, critical historians delete from their Jesus story the account of the Transfiguration, sometimes regarding it as a story of Jesus' resurrection appearance. That, for some reason, has been placed near the center of Mark, where it remained in Matthew and Luke. Likewise, the miracle stories, especially the so-called nature miracles, such as calming the storm or feeding a crowd with one boy's lunch, have been put aside, while those stories that might report psychological healings and exorcisms have been retained, since they have analogies today. After the quest of the historical Jesus, to borrow the title of Albert Schweitzer's classic study, set aside the references to divine action, that is, the supernatural, attention was then directed to the words of Jesus and to the gospel reports of the non-miraculous events. What must not be missed here is that by deleting from Jesus' history all references to divine action, critics set aside precisely those parts of the gospel by which the evangelists expressed most explicitly their understanding of the ongoing significance of Jesus, his perfect tense. The expanded content. Having omitted the supernatural elements from consideration, critical historians add a great deal to the remaining gospel material in order to make up for what the Jesus tradition had omitted. A closer look at the Gospels will expose the significance of these additions. The canonical Gospels rely on an anonymous narrator to provide the storyline or plot, and sometimes to comment on a story or saying. The storyline is created by the way the narrator connects the individual Jesus traditions, usually by reporting a change of scene or time, as in Mark chapter 2, when he returned to Capernaum, and as he sat at dinner, or one Sabbath. Scholars assume that the Jesus traditions were handed on orally, and that in this process the users gave the material a form that was generally stable but not inflexible. Stories were reduced to essential elements, mentioning specific places more often than specific times. Although the action occurs in real places, there is little interaction between Jesus and these places. Apart from Jerusalem, place names are mostly stage settings and are not significant parts of the plot. Mentioning place names, however, anchors the stories in historical and geographical reality, especially for readers living in the general area where the action had occurred. Real historical time is indicated in references to known persons, such as Pilate or Herod Antipas, but only Luke carefully sets the story in explicitly datable time. The Jesus story in the Gospels did not occur once upon a time. Although Matthew and Luke are expansions and modifications of Mark, they generally retain its overall storyline. Jesus' mission, of unstated length, is centered in the villages of Galilee until he resolves to go to Jerusalem, where the account becomes more integrated and occupies, from a chronological perspective, a disproportionately large amount of the text. Although resistance to Jesus is mentioned early, the Gospels do not present a real development of opposition, but simply call attention to it from time to time. Opponents are rarely named. They usually are identified as a group, the Pharisees,